Spending a little time out on the water today. I thought maybe you guys would like a change of scenery. So, thanks for coming out with me. And I hope you enjoy today's cozy horror from the lake. We all have some strange rituals in our lives. Maybe it's a place we like to write, or a thing we like to carry with us for luck or for security. Well, the subject of today's story has a very interesting way of getting through his day. So, I hope he makes this shot so that the world will live. It's something I'd heard my whole life, though it's never been this clear. If I make this shot, the world lives. As a kid, it would rustle across my brain like a flock of birds. Sometimes if I was thinking hard about something, and sometimes when I was just being quiet and trying to focus. It was never distracting, never something that tore me away from my day-to-day life, and in fact, it made me feel safe. It wasn't even in my voice, not any voice I was familiar with. They say that when you talk to yourself, and your internal voice talks back to you, it's still your voice. This voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. My whole life, it sounded like the same childish trill. As I got older and started going to church, I started to think it might be something different. I noticed that the voice always came before something good, giving me the confidence to try things I wouldn't normally do. I'd hear the voice just before a test, or right before I stepped up to bat, and I'd know that everything was about to turn out great. The more it happened, the more I became convinced that I was special. The longer it went on, the more I thought I was hearing the voice of God. I told my priest about it, my family being very Catholic, and he said it sounded like I had a close relationship with God. Even at 8 years old, I could tell that he didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I knew what I was hearing, and I knew it was important. The more it pushed me towards success, the more I started saying it to myself like a mantra. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I went on stage for a debate. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I took a test. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I hit a ball, or threw a basketball, or did anything I wanted to succeed at. And if I heard the voice say it back, then I'd know that I was about to do great things. It's what pushed me into the priesthood, and pushed me to my ultimate act of blasphemy. That's not the right word, but it's the best I can think of. It had been 30 years since I'd first heard that voice, and I was now a young priest with a church of my own. I had built a reputation with the other priests for writing sermons that kept parishioners in their seats, and having a lot of luck regarding matters with the diocese. I'd gotten through the ranks faster than most, doing very well on my tests of catechism and church doctrine. At this rate, I was on my way to becoming one of the youngest bishops in my area. I had never told any of them about the voices, thinking it was similar to the way people in the Bible had heard the voice of God once upon a time. I knew it wasn't okay for me to think of myself as a prophet, but whatever the reason, I was still certain that it was the voice of God. I should have been pleased, but I found myself thinking more and more about the nature of the phrase. I'd hear it before sermons sometimes, and know that today's reflection on the Lord's words would be particularly captivating. I still said it to myself before doing anything, and I realized that it'd become kind of a lucky charm to me. Things would go well, and I would attribute it to the mantra. But why did I make this leap? Because it had always been? I needed to be sure. So I started doing research. Luckily, or unluckily, the Catholic Church has a lot of resources for those looking to research the nature of religion. There was a lot of information on prophets, others who had communicated with God and his messengers, but my own situation was unique. I heard the same phrase again and again, and if it was the voice of God, then it was the first for such repetition. God told his prophets and chosen mouthpieces what he wanted them to do. Go to Nineveh, free the Hebrews, sacrifice your son. Whatever he was asking people to do, he was always very specific. If I make this shot, the world will live was not particularly specific, though. I don't want any of you reading this to think that I went in only from a position of faith. I started by having a checkup with Dr. Redmond, my family physician. He ran a series of tests to determine if I had any underlying conditions, perhaps a tumor or some undiagnosed schizophrenia. It would have been easier if it was just something I could chalk up to external stimuli, but Dr. Redmond told me I was healthy as a horse when the results came back. EKG, EEG, X-ray, physical, CT scan, heck, you even passed the cardiac battery with flying colors. I hope the Vatican has deep pockets, because I'd imagine you just broke your healthcare budget for the year. I thanked him, figuring the church could foot the bill for my upcoming research. With the tests showing that I was in the right state of mind with a sound body, I started studying ways to instigate a more receptive state. There were several accounts of priests fasting and praying so they could speak with God, and while the idea of starving myself didn't appeal to me, it seemed to be the best way to find out more about the voice. It had never changed through the years, still sounding youngish with the first rumblings of depth, and I wanted to know if the phrase had some deeper meaning. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but if he had some job for me, I needed to disseminate what it was. I told my aides what I meant to do, giving them special instructions not to bother me, but to check on me periodically. If they found me passed out or unconscious, they had specific instructions to offer aid. If I was hurting myself, worse than depriving myself of sleep and food I meant, they were to call the hospital and have me admitted. As long as I was still praying or meditating or not doing myself any harm, they would leave me to it. I planned to conduct my little experiment from Sunday night to Saturday night of the following week, and on the following Sunday, I would come to Mass with something to talk about for my weekly sermon. I had no idea how prophetic that statement would be. So, after Mass on Sunday night, I locked myself in my study, ate my last meal for the week, and began to read. I started at the beginning, reading of creation and of the garden, and as the hours stretched on, I began to read aloud to keep myself awake. The first night was easily the hardest. My body cried out for sleep as my stomach grumbled for lack of food. By the time Brother Joseph had come to check on me the next morning, I was past the worst of it and still reciting the book of Numbers. He left me water, asking me how I felt before leaving me to it. This was the height of my excitement for the project. I'd only been awake for about a day, and my zeal was still running high. I had heard the words 3 or 4 times throughout the night, and they had been clearer than they had ever been before. Sometimes the words were muffled, sounding like a kid's tin can phone, but that night the words were crisp and clear. I read for the rest of the day, hearing them 2 more times, and as night settled in, I felt tired, but still with hope and God's love. By day 3, some of my enthusiasm was starting to slip. I'd heard the words a few more times, twice perhaps, but I was starting to feel the effects of sleep deprivation. My stomach was also in a knot, and my head was swimming as my blood sugar fluctuated wildly. I had read stories about men fasting for weeks at a time, and I couldn't imagine another day of this. The only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that, the few times I'd heard it, the voice had been clear as a bell. Thursday night found me doing laps in my study when I finally got my answer. I had finished the Bible Wednesday night, and had moved on to the Contemplations of Dogma by Cardinal Mansfield. I had thought about praying, but it was tempting to sleep if I wasn't walking. I had been awake for 4 days now, and my desire to rest was almost as invasive as my desire to eat. I was dizzy as I read, the words running together, and as a stomach cramp hit me, I saw the book tumble from my hands as I doubled over. I thought I might throw up the water I had drunk a few hours ago, but instead I continued forward and fell to the floor. I landed next to the book, my world going black as I fell over, and I wasn't sure if I was going to wake up. If I make this shot, the world lives. I could hear the voice as if someone were whispering it into my ear. I opened my eyes and was suddenly aware of floating. I was hovering over the shoulder of a young giant, his face that of a high school or college student. He was writing an essay, his pencil scratching on the page as he toiled away at his work. He would stop and erase something before starting again, and as I moved closer, I could see that he had a small stack of finished papers beside him on the desk. How long he'd been writing on this essay was anyone's guess, but with an angry growl, I watched him crumble up the page before turning in his chair to face me. If I make this shot, the world lives. With a smooth and practiced arc, I watched him toss the paper into a nearby garbage pail before returning to his work, his pencil scratching away as he wrote. I was speechless. What was I seeing here? Was this God? It couldn't be. Could it? As he furrowed his brow, I saw that this essay wasn't the only thing on his desk. There was a manuscript, too, the title page proclaiming it to be Golden Fields. I began to understand why I had heard him say the mantra so many times. I assumed it was part of his process, and the throwing away of ideas was as much a part of it as writing itself. If I were to read that manuscript, I wondered, would I find a priest in it? Perhaps one who hears voices? Was this man my creator? My God? The architect of everything that I knew and loved? I came to in the emergency room, Brother Marcus having found me seizing on the floor and called an ambulance. Now I lie here, contemplating what I saw. Was it real? Did I actually see these things? Did I actually see this being, or was it something my mind created? As I sit here, I can still hear the words from time to time, but I don't say them anymore. The church has given me a short leave of absence, but I don't know if I can ever go back to my old life. How can I preach of God and glory while I know in my heart that we exist because of a single being and his ability to throw a paper ball into a hoop? It makes me realize how insubstantial we are, how little we matter. But that's not the worst thing that has occurred to me while I lay here. As I sit and listen to the listless beeps of the machine, I find my mind circling back to the same question again and again. If he should miss his next shot, what would happen? Would we ever know? If he missed his next shot, would we continue to live? Or simply snuff out into non-existence? There's just something about being out on the water. I don't know. I've always lived pretty close to the water, and it always soothes me to be out on it, to be near it, to hear it. I don't know. You guys feel that way too? We've all, subscribed to some weird box services. I'm certainly no stranger to them. But when the subject of today's story joins a rather odd hunt-a-killer service, we see that hunting a killer may be a little more difficult than they assumed. When the box arrived, Emily was thrilled. She'd been waiting for this particular package since March, and at long last it was here. Emily had been trying to get into one of these cold case box services for a while. Hunt-a-killer, cold case, sleuth kings, she'd requested them all, but all Emily got back were apology letters and promises that they would contact her when they had room. The folks at Catch-a-Killer had placed her on their tentative waiting list, which sometimes took months, and she hadn't expected to be added to the list for quite some time. It was hard to get added. They only approved a few hundred people a year, and they were also one of the more popular groups. The service was their typical monthly subscription box, where they sent a cold case that the small group you found yourself to be a part of tried to solve. They would send clues a few at a time, a slow drip of evidence that would lead the group to the end conclusion, and they would follow the trail to a predictable end. As she brought the box inside, Emily felt giddy with anticipation. However, some of it was tempered when she stopped to look at the box. The label said "To Catch a Killer," but the address label was torn off, and the box looked a little bit funny. If this was their way of creating ambience, then Emily felt they'd done a great job. The box was battered and dirty, the clear tape around it looking thick and yellow, and the letters were pieced together out of newspaper clippings. It was a nice touch, if not a little cliché. The letter inside was no exception. The whole thing was made of magazine and newspaper letters, meticulously assembled by hand. At least, it appeared as such. Emily couldn't imagine how much time this had taken whoever had put it together, especially if they had to build more than a few of them. Emily had to applaud their commitment, but it wasn't something that seemed feasible long term. She would be surprised if this level of detail persisted, and took the note out of the box so she could read it. This is the case of the West End Tooth Fairy. He has a kill count of around 26, and was most prominent between 2019 and 2022. His first victim was Miss Mary Klein, a retired teacher who lived alone. It took the police almost 4 years to place her as his victim, only then because his pattern began to surface. She was stabbed 15 times, most of them in the chest, and a smile was carved across her mouth from ear to ear. No forensic evidence was discovered at the scene, no sign of forced entry, and she was left in her favorite chair in the living room. No one was charged with her death, and only one item was ever reported missing from the victim: the bottom and top plate of her dentures. Emily read it over a few times, but couldn't figure out what she was supposed to be looking for. This was less of a case file and more of a story. Emily had read a few articles about how the information was disseminated, and then picked over by the community, but this read more like a creepypasta. She wondered if this might be one of those things where a group member got a different piece of the puzzle, but that was another point of confusion as she looked through the box. As she looked, Emily saw a plastic baggie with a pair of pliers inside. She took them out hesitantly, the red around the teeth of the pliers looking pretty convincing. Emily gave the box a once-over, finding them a pretty good prop for the price of the box service. Once the pliers and the note were out, though, the box was empty. There was no group code or information on getting up with the rest of your team, and after a thorough search, she found nothing. Emily shrugged, not too upset about it. They had probably just forgotten to add it, and she figured that a quick trip to the internet would get her in contact with her group. She was still excited about her quick admittance to the group, and hopped on the site to see what she could find. A little while later, Emily closed her laptop with a huff of frustration. She had checked every group, but no one was following the Tooth Fairy case. No one seemed to know what she was talking about either, and it was starting to make her wonder. Maybe the others would sign up soon. Maybe she had gotten her box a little too early. In the end, she set up a room for the Tooth Fairy case, figuring the others would find her, and decided to go to bed. She'd sign on tomorrow and find that they had discovered her, and then the game could begin. Instead, she woke up to find another dodgy package on her front porch, and only a few messages in the room she had started, none of them helpful. The people who had found the room appeared to have used her post as an excuse to belittle her. The 3 or 4 users who had left comments were quick to remark that the Tooth Fairy case was little more than an urban legend, not likely to be something Catch-a-Killer would tackle. They made fun of her for even suggesting that they received a case file on this one, and decided that she must be trolling. Today's box looked like it had gotten wet, and the cardboard was dark and distorted. Emily huffed and deleted their comments, setting the box on the table as she cleared her own inbox. This was what she got for asking for help on the internet. Most of these people were just shut-ins with little more to do than bother her, and she knew she shouldn't take it personally. Even so, Emily reflected that it was frustrating that none of the others who'd received the case files had hopped in to share information. As she sat grumbling at the computer screen, she found her eyes straying to the box and finally decided to open it. The material felt as damp as she'd expected, but that only added to the mystery. It hadn't rained last night, or for the last few days, and she couldn't believe that anyone would have delivered a package in such condition. And why was it here so early? It was near noon, but the mail didn't usually run until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. The box had been waiting for her when she opened the door. leading her to believe that it had been dropped off much earlier. Inside the box was another of those strange notes, the letter made of magazine clippings, and an envelope that she thought might contain pictures. His next victims were the Hughes children, Mary, Shelley, and Clark, ages 12, 10, and 8, respectively. Coming in through the window in their bedroom, he tied them up and made them watch as he stabbed them to death from oldest to youngest. Each of them was stabbed 20 to 30 times. Their parents found them the next morning, both having slept through the night as their children died mere feet away. The oldest child was found to have her lower canines removed, the middle child her bottom incisors, and the youngest was missing his bottom premolars. The teeth were believed to have been taken as a trophy, and that was when the police began calling him the Tooth Fairy, though the press wouldn't start using it until much later. As she took out the pictures, Emily felt her blood run cold as she flipped the top back. There were 12 pictures inside, all seemingly taken with a Polaroid camera. All of them were of crying children, their hands tied behind them and their mouths stuffed with whatever they had at hand. The girls appeared to be older than the brother, all of them bearing the same sandy hair and hazel eyes. And as the pictures carried on, Emily could see the fearful children becoming broken children. Their pajamas reddened, their wounds seeming to grow with each snapshot, and by the end, all three were lying on the carpet together. As their blood seeped into the thick shag, Emily felt the pictures slip from her numb fingers. What was this? It was a little too much if this was someone's idea of a joke or a game. She had wanted to be part of this game, but if this was the level they were playing at, she wasn't sure she was up to it. These Polaroids looked real, like something taken instead of made, and as Emily held them, they felt dirty in her hands. She put them in the box and picked up her computer as she tried to discover anything about the case that she was being drip-fed. This was the second box she'd received that felt more like a love letter to the killer and less like a case file. There were no clues to follow, no breadcrumbs to lead her to an outcome, just harrowing stories to listen to that ultimately didn't tell her anything. If this was how it was, she really needed to see if anyone else had received the clues she was failing to find. The forum offered more veiled insults, and Emily huffed as she closed the laptop. With no words from the admin and no help forthcoming from her fellow investigators, she couldn't do much but speculate. In the end, she dumped the contents of the box into the first one and threw the new box away. When her eyes kept darting over to it as it sat on the top layer of the garbage can, she pulled it out and took it to the outside garbage. She couldn't stand the way it seemed to be watching her, and as she came back up the front steps of the porch, she stopped in her tracks as she saw the last thing she expected to see. Another cardboard box, covered in old yellow tape, was on her welcome mat, sitting like a steaming pile of fresh foreboding. Emily looked around, suddenly not feeling so safe standing in front of her own house. How had she missed it? It hadn't just appeared between her leaving her front door and putting the box in the garbage can. It had taken a matter of minutes, 2 or 3 at the most, and someone would have had to place the box quickly and quietly in order to get it here in the interim. Someone like a serial killer who stole people's teeth and kept them as trophies. Emily shook the thought off and reached down to pick up the box. She must have just missed it on the way out, must have stepped right over it. But that didn't stop her from locking the deadbolt and throwing the chain across the door. She took the box to the dining room table, but it would be quite a while before she found the courage to open it. She looked at it as she cleaned her house, returning to it a few times throughout the day. She didn't want to open it, was honestly afraid of what might be in it, but it still hung over her like an omen. As fearful as she was, it was a very tantalizing mystery, and Emily loved a good mystery. As the sun went down and the shadows grew tall in her living room, Emily was helpless to stop herself from ripping off the tape. The box had the same wet, warped look the other one had borne. And as the tape came off, Emily was greeted by yet another handmade note and a long metal tool that made her grit her teeth. It was an ice pick, and someone had clearly used it roughly. The end was dented, the metal flowering up around the point of impact. The tip was malformed, that angry exclamation almost as damaged as the butt end, and it helped the red paint find its way into the porous metal that sought to drink it up. It worked its way into the crevices, and the dark red made the tool all the more grotesque. The fourth victim was Dr. Reynolds of the Norvis Free Clinic. Posing as a homeless man, he came in before operating hours and killed the good doctor before his staff could arrive. The Tooth Fairy had chosen Dr. Reynolds carefully, the two bearing a striking resemblance. It was easy for him to pose as Dr. Reynolds and continue to see patients. The next 12 victims were homeless people at the clinic, people he invited to come in after hours. The cause of death for all was the same as Dr. Reynolds, a single puncture wound to the side of the neck. From these victims, the Tooth Fairy completed his collection of bottom teeth. She added the pick to the box of other things before slipping it into the hall closet and going to sit in her room. Suddenly, the living room was a little too open, the windows too exposed for Emily's taste. She sat in bed, trying not to think about the boxes or the mystery that surrounded them. The more of them she received, the more she had to remind herself that this was just something cooked up by the company. It became harder and harder to justify to herself, though, as the contents became more graphic. She had read a lot of forum posts before signing up, and none of this seemed like the experiences she had read about. The cases were spooky sometimes, but there was always a group of people to help you solve them. Doing this alone was making her anxious, and the clues weren't really pointing her towards a suspect at all. This was reading more like a story, and less like a case. She wasn't sure what to take away from this, besides the crawling anxiety that surrounded her. She checked the group again, and found nothing but more people making fun of her for suggesting Catch a Killer would cover anything like the Tooth Fairy case. It's not even real. It's an urban legend. No, it's real, but the group only handles cases with suspects and evidence. The killer never leaves anything behind. The case is too high profile to let a bunch of amateurs mess it up by stepping on what little evidence they have. It was pages of stuff like that, but nothing helpful. None of the admins had posted either, and Emily supposed they were on vacation. They couldn't weigh in on forum topics, they couldn't answer her questions, and it seemed like they couldn't be bothered to do much at all. Emily set her phone on the nightstand and got ready for bed again, deciding that she wouldn't open any more of the packages until someone else messaged the group to say that they'd received their packages. She needed help, she needed some perspective, and she wasn't going to get it in an echo chamber. As she fell asleep, she thought that at least it shouldn't be possible for them to send a fourth box so soon. It had probably been a fluke to send her 3 so close together, and she drifted off, hoping there might be someone to help her when the fourth arrived. She woke up the next morning to the sounds of birds and the gentle chime of her phone alarm. Emily felt a little better in the light of day, the megrims of the night before lost with the dawn filling her living room. She booted up her computer, intending to get some work done today before her boss called and complained about her lack of progress lately. First, however, she wanted breakfast. As the eggs and bacon sizzled in the pan, Emily felt all the anxiety of the night before dribbling away. She had made too much out of all this. She always psyched herself up so much over these things. Between the quarantine and working from home, she'd had too much time to mull over these dark corners. It might be time to get some of this under control. Maybe the box service was a little too much. She should cancel it and try again some other time. She had taken her phone out to do just that, her breakfast balanced on top of a cup of coffee, when something caught her eye in the peripheral. She was standing in the foyer, heading for the little office that she'd set up in the living room, when The spot found its way into her peripheral. She imagined that she could hear the tendons in her neck creaking as she turned her head to see if her fears were correct, and felt the plate wobble as the coffee shook in her hand. It couldn't be. It was 7 in the morning. The mail hadn't even thought about running yet. The package was sitting on the front porch, the center of her welcome mat, leering at her through the glass of the front door. She stood there for a count of 30, her mind whirling at the sight of the large brown box. But in the end, she didn't drop her food or dissolve into a puddle of terror. She turned away from the door and went to her desk. If she meant to continue buying box services, eggs, coffee, or paying the mortgage on her house, she needed to do some work. As she got to her tasks for the day, Emily found that her eyes just wouldn't stay off the package on the stoop. She couldn't see it from her desk. There was a wall in the way. But the mirror in the foyer gave her a perfect view of the front door. She had placed it there to see people when they came up. But now what appeared less than convenient. She tried to keep her mind on medical coding, but it was difficult with the non-existent eyes of the package on her. Her mind itched to see what was inside, little as she wanted to. It would be another horror show, she was certain, and it would be for her alone, since no one else seemed to be sharing it with her. Around 11, Emily finally sighed in frustration and pushed the keyboard away. She had done almost nothing in the 4 hours that she'd been working, and the sooner she got the package out of her mind, the better. She got up to go bring the package in, but as she moved into the foyer, she stopped again. There was a second package sitting in the shadow of the first. She stared at it, her mind reeling as she pondered how it had gotten there. She'd had a perfect view of the door. There was no way that anyone could have snuck up and delivered a package in broad daylight without her seeing them. She stepped towards the door, feeling the tug of curiosity, but stopped as she saw the obvious answer. The second box was a little smaller than the other one. In her apprehension at the sight of the box, she had just overlooked the second one. That was it, just a failure to notice. The thought made her feel secure enough to turn away from the door and go make some lunch. She was coming back with her sandwich and a fresh cup of coffee when she looked again and saw a third box perched on top of the first. She'd been thinking that she might be able to get some work done, but seeing that third box, that dark brown cardboard monstrosity, she began to doubt the web of excuses that she had crafted. If they could sneak in a third box, they could have easily slipped in the second. If it hadn't been there, they had slipped in while she wasn't looking and delivered it without a sound. She returned to her computer long enough to find the contact information to Catch a Killer and called their customer service line. This was getting out of hand, and if no one was going to return her messages, then she'd just go to the source. Mazer Incorporated, this is Janet speaking. How may I direct your call? Emily wet her lips, not expecting such a quick response. She plowed on before the anger could cool, though. Yes, I'm trying to reach someone with Catch a Killer box service. This was the number they had listed online, and I... But the bubbly woman on the other end cut her off. Of course, 1 moment, please. 30 seconds of canned music later, and another far too happy young woman picked up the phone and asked Emily how she could help her. Yeah, I recently signed up for your service, but I think something's wrong. I've received at least 6 packages in the last 3 days, and it's always at random times. I can't seem to find anyone online that's part of the same group as me, and I think I'm getting parts of cases that require other parts to solve. The level of detail is really impressive on the boxes, but the volume is a little creepy. I think I'd either like to be put in another group or just cancel the service altogether, please. The woman then I seed through the whole conversation, and the background sound of keys clacking made Emily grit her teeth. I'm terribly sorry you're dissatisfied with our service, ma'am. You can absolutely have a refund, and I'll cancel your service. Feel free to keep the materials you've already received for your trouble. Do you know which case file you're assigned to? It's the Tooth Fairy case. The clicking abruptly stopped. You must be mistaken, ma'am. That's not a case we offer at this time. Not one we plan to offer in the future, either. Emily had been pacing, but stopped as the woman's words fell on her like a piano. That's the information I've been getting in the mail. All the boxes contain these little handmade letters and pictures and descriptions of murders. Let me get your information, ma'am. I'll see what group we have you assigned to. Emily gave her the info she'd filled in on the website, and after a few minutes of clicking, she could swear she heard the woman's teeth grinding together. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you aren't on our client list. You're on our tentative approval list, but we haven't taken your payment for the current cycle of case files. Emily stopped in the foyer, glancing fitfully out the front door as she tried to make sense of all of this. There was a fourth box on top of the other one, and as the golden afternoon set over the house, she felt a chill creep up her spine. What does that mean? She whispered, not daring to speak too loudly. It means that whoever's sending you those packages isn't anyone from our office. Emily was speechless, and as the woman called to her from the other end of the phone, she let it slip out of her hand and tumble to the hardwood. Emily wanted to call the police, but her curiosity was piqued. It was the same curiosity that had led her to sign up for the service in the first place. But now it had led her into a mystery that she hadn't been prepared for. As she wrapped her hand around the doorknob, she knew that there was no going back. If she looked in those boxes, if she cut the tape and saw what lay inside, she'd never be able to go back again. She opened the door, poking her head out like a groundhog from his hole. She expected something to be waiting out there for her, but the porch was empty except for the boxes. She juggled the four of them into her arms and brought them inside, closing the door and twisting the deadbolt before taking them to her bedroom. She left the phone in the foyer, taking all the boxes and locking herself behind her bedroom door. Spilling them onto her bed, she wondered what order she would open them in. Looking at them again, though, she realized each was numbered with a quick squirt of magic marker. Taking the largest, the one with the childish 4 on it, she strained a little at the weight of it. Something rumbled angrily inside, and as she slid her penknife over the tape, she was unsurprised to find a roofing hammer inside. Like the chisel, the head was spattered with a deep red stain, and the tines on the end were likewise painted. What had the third box said? His victims had been killed by blunt force trauma to the base of the skull. After seeing the pictures of the children, she doubted he could contain himself from cutting and slicing them after the fact. He'd wanted to kill them quickly before they could give him away, but he still wanted the thrill of slicing them up. The note inside was quite illuminating. His next 3 victims were an odd fellow looking to have some teeth extracted, a census taker that he suspected might be working for the police, and the private detective that ultimately caused him to abandon the free clinic. The detective had a friend in the local police force, a friend whom he'd told before heading to investigate the rumors of missing people at the clinic. The Tooth Fairy avoided the raid meant to catch him and added 6 more teeth to his collection. From the old man, he took the front incisors. From the census taker, the 2 top incisors next to them. Finally, from the nosy investigator, he took the top canines and left on a bus as the police raided his hunting ground. She paused before opening the 5th. Had she heard a sound in the living room? She wanted to check, but the knife made such a satisfying sound on the tape as she opened it. Inside was a business card for someone named Carol Barner. The legend beneath proclaimed her to be a webmaster from Mazer Inc., and Emily suspected that she already knew what the note would tell her, how easy it had been for the packages to arrive at her house. almost like someone had her name and address. She thought again that she'd heard a noise from the living room, the breaking of glass or the crunch of a boot crushing something fragile. It might even been the breaking of a phone, as someone stepped on it after she'd carelessly left it in the foyer. She read the note quickly, wondering how much time she had left. His next victim was Carol Barner. Carol was selected at random, a crime of convenience that turned out to be very helpful. Carol was his neighbor, someone who worked from home as the pandemic raged. Carol liked to work late into the night, and her keyboard was so very loud. He had tried to be good, tried to lay low for a while as he settled into a new town, but the clacking was driving him mad. One night, as he watched 2 o'clock roll by with no reprieve, he took the continued noise as a sign from above. He broke into her apartment, and she never even noticed over the sound of her keyboard until it stopped tapping forever. In doing so, he discovered what it was she'd been working on, and found a way to finish his work without the hassle of finding more victims. He discovered the database that she'd been tapping away at, and after taking her premolars, he set to work. Her hands shook as she opened the next box, the knife threatening to cut her as it jittered over the adhesive. She could hear him as he moved through the house, being less than quiet as he yanked open doors and cabinets. He knew where she was. He had to, but it was all the thrill for him. He wanted her good and scared before he went about his business, and Emily had to still her hands as she read the note that lay atop the flyer for Catch a Killer. The flyer with the red stain distorting the K in killer and made it run like a wound. His next 8 victims were just everyday crime junkies, people who loved to research and speculate from the comfort of their home. He had a large pool to choose from, and it was easy to select those who wouldn't be missed or would take time to be discovered. Glenn Howell was a freelance coder with a passion for cold cases. Linda Merrill was a divorced housewife whose children had flown the nest, leaving her plenty of time to consume her true crime content. Courtney Powell and Linda Kane were roommates, and it was a wonder the 15 cats in their apartment hadn't got them before he did. John Boyd, Claire Keene, Reagan Summers, Casey Greer, they all took the bait and became true crime content all their own. Each kill swelled the legend of the Tooth Fairy. Each added another name to his tally, and each gave him another piece of the puzzle. As the police searched for him, looking for anything that could discover his identity, the Tooth Fairy found the last piece he needed, his final victim. The knob rattled, turning slowly as it hit the lock. Whoever was on the other side didn't kick, didn't yell, didn't fret. He knew they had all night. He knew she had nowhere to go, since there were no windows in her room, and there was no escape, except through the door that he was now standing in front of. No one was going to come for her, and it was just the two of them, until matters were resolved. He had to get inside anyway. Emily had all his tools. He had sent her everything he would need to make her another case file for some other true crime fan to speculate over. Would they wonder how she had been so easily caught? Would they question the validity of such a killer? Maybe the sheer idiocy of it all would help cement the legend of the Tooth Fairy into something told around campfires and under blankets as flashlights lit ghostly faces. Sometimes that was what really made the story, the idea that something like that could never happen to you. She opened the last box as he moved about her house like a fitful spirit, clearly savoring the moment. When she took the letter out, she yelped in surprise and let it fall to the floor. The last grisly totem fell to the carpet, clicking merrily as Emily watched it. It all made sense now. The name, The trophies, the order of the theft. He had needed them, needed to complete his masterpiece. He had to have a complete set, otherwise it wouldn't look right. She tore her eyes away from the grim spectacle and looked at the letter that was likely to tell her of his last victim. A victim she knew all too well. His last victim was Emily Colney. Emily fancied herself a true crime enthusiast. She petitioned multiple services since the beginning of the pandemic, but was never invited to join their groups. She wrote all of them in her application to catch a killer. And when it pinged on the database, the Tooth Fairy decided to make her dream come true and give her the true crime experience of a lifetime. Emily Colney, the perpetual shut-in on Hawthorne Street, would have the distinction of being the Tooth Fairy's last victim. After her, he would break his pattern and thus become harder to link to the crimes that would come after her. So thank you, Emily. Thank you for helping me complete my masterpiece. The door shuddered, and Emily dropped the note. It fluttered down to land on the grisly trophy on the floor, and she was forced to put her hand far too close to it as she picked up the note. It was a mishmash, a golem, a creation of love and hate, and it hurt her to look at. It seemed that Mary's denture plates had been put to good use, and the teeth within them were as different as they were misshapen. He had lovingly set them into the plastic, and they looked like an animal trap, just waiting to bite. The false teeth were missing only one set, and as the door splintered, Emily grabbed the hammer she'd received the day before and held it at the ready. A hand slipped through the hole in the door, grasping the lock with a smooth and practiced twist as he opened the door and let himself in. She saw him then, rising to his full height as he filled her doorway like a ghoul in a cast-off coat. He was massive, his head looking grotesquely small as it peeked down from between his huge shoulders. She felt the hammer slip from her hand as the smell of him wafted over her, the aroma of dirt, campfires, old chemicals, and ancient blood. She didn't start screaming until he smiled at her, his spitty, toothless mouth revealing empty gums. Gums waiting for what lay on the floor between them. Gums waiting for Emily to complete their reward for years of patience. Can't really say that the fish are biting today, but that's okay. Sometimes I just like to bob on the water. I'm usually a catch and release guy anyway. I don't really like cooking them or killing them. It's just not my way, I guess. We've all slept in some questionable places, but we always have to be a little careful when we decide to stay at those shady roadside motels. Sometimes it's because we're afraid that we're going to get kidnapped. And sometimes it's a fear that the bed bugs might bite. It's the little things sometimes. A good meal, a familiar song on the radio, a soft bed to sleep in after sleeping on benches or in sleeping bags for the past few years. The last one had been tainted for me after that night. I didn't think of myself as homeless. I had a beautiful house in Tampa, Florida, where my wife and my kids lived. I had access to the bay, a 2-car garage, a big backyard for the kids to play in. It also had my wife's new husband, the guy she married after our divorce. So, I'm not exactly welcome there. After the papers were finalized, I literally walked from the courthouse to a camping store, and after $400 charged to the credit card I shared with my ex-wife, I felt I had everything I needed to start a more carefree life. I thought I'd just live rough from now on, and to hell with everything else. I would ride the rails, take day labor, and just be an explorer in the modern age. That's what I thought of myself as, an explorer instead of just a vagrant. After doing that for about 5 years, I've learned a few things, and lost a lot of the crap I bought on that long ago day. I've learned which towns will ask you to leave and which towns will throw you in jail for public vagrancy. I've learned which day labor companies are willing to work with guys who sleep in alleys. I've learned the best way to get a shower and a shave in a public restroom without attracting attention. It's gyms. Gyms are the best for that. But above all else, I've learned that sometimes it's best to treat yourself when you can manage. That's what I was doing. I was trying to treat myself and get out of the heat for the night. I grew up in South Florida, so the heat is no stranger to me. I remember sleeping with the windows up, ceiling fan on, hoping for a breeze to rustle the curtains as I stuck to my sheets. The heat doesn't bother me like it does a lot of people, but this year had just been so hot. The heat was near constant, and I had rolled my sleeping bag up for the season and slept on a threadbare blanket on the ground most nights. I was in a rural area close to Alabama, one farm community with a short name and a small population. I spent my days unloading or moving freight at the train depot, and my nights trying to find a nice place to bed down. Sometimes I'd do day labor, sometimes I'd do odd jobs for people, but the police left me be for the most part, and I thanked them by not getting drunk and making an ass of myself. I was considering making this a regular thing, staying for a few months and renting a trailer at the Happy Acres trailer court, but then I got the word from Doris that they were downsizing a bit, and they couldn't really afford to keep paying me under the table. Doris was a sweet 55-year-old grandmother who was just trying to make it to retirement, and she told me that she was very sorry, but they were just going to have to let me go. I didn't really mind, I suppose. I took it as a sign that it was time to move on to somewhere else. Time to do some exploring farther north, maybe. It was getting close to harvest time, and there were plenty of little towns in Alabama or Georgia where a man could get farm labor work and bed in the barn or a bunkhouse. It was hard work, but it was good work. And I was hopeful as I took the small collection of cash that Doris had collected for me and set out on the road. That whole day, though, was the hottest day I had ever experienced. I hit the road about 8 a.m., and I was walking up the side of the highway by 9. It was the last week of July, and you could see the heat as it baked off the asphalt. The sun was high, and by 10 I was sweating as I prayed for a semi to come blowing past. It was little relief when one finally did, though. The air that buffeted into my face was like a giant exhaling on me. I thought longingly about the big fan running on the docks and how I could catch a long breeze between unloading and loading trains as I drove my forklift underneath it. By afternoon, I was miserable. My back felt like it weighed about 500 pounds, and the straps dug into my sore shoulders. I was in Alabama. I had stopped at the rest stop to use the bathroom at the border, but I was a good piece from Dothan, the closest big city. If I could get there, I could get some day labor, find a farmer looking for laborers for the season. I could even just pick up a job at a depot or as a fry cook or something, so I could afford to stay indoors until it was time to move on again. As I walked that first day, I even dared to dream that I might find something less temporary and make Dothan a long stop. I had grown up on a farm, picking vegetables and milking cows and taking care of horses, and the idea that I might get along with some farmer and become his stableman or his labor foreman was appealing. On the other hand, I was a lapsed accountant, too. I had worked for an office in Tampa and could easily get back with a place and make that my life again. I could get an apartment, have a stable job again, maybe even see my kids sometime if they wanted. Like I said, big cities are sometimes full of possibilities, and there's little else to do on the road but daydream. When night fell, I was squarely in the Badlands. For those of you unfamiliar with Highway 98, there's a stretch before you get to Dothan where there isn't much of anything but fireworks stands and little houses. There are occasional gas stations. Hell, there's even a really nice casino out there that no one ever goes to. But if you're on foot and seeing it through the headlights of passing cars, it can be a little spooky. The remains of abandoned houses that are slowly being reclaimed by the land look a lot like haunted houses when the lights of a passing semi suddenly bring them to life. The broken windows of a failing business seem to leer at passers-by as a minivan screams away from them. The heat was still baking up through the soles of my boots, too, and I was starting to wobble a little when I finally decided to stop for the night. It was 8, some pink still on the horizon, but the heat of the 12-hour walk had exhausted me. I had intended to move over into the nearby scrublands and try to find some respite from the hot evening, but when the lighted sign appeared at the bottom of the hill, I thought it might be Providence throwing me a bone. Eddie's Discount Motel rotated garishly on a sign out front, and I could see a little neon sign beneath it that read Vacancies. I had about $200 in the compartment in my backpack, and about $60 in my left sock. Depending on how much of a discount Eddie's rooms were at, I might find a nice bed for the evening. As I walked to the bottom of the hill, I started daydreaming again, thinking about the continental breakfast, a hot shower, maybe some HBO before settling into a real bed for the night. I could check out around 10 and be on the road again, maybe even making Dothan before dark tomorrow. I barely noticed the hot tar under my feet, or the arid blasts that flapped my coat when the cars went by. I was on my way to something better, I thought. When the lobby door opened, I sighed in ecstasy as the cool air hit me in the face. The lobby was dingy, and calling it so might even be charitable. The furniture was of the bus station variety, and there was a magazine sitting on one discussing the first term of Barack Obama. My daydreams about continental breakfast drifted away, and I approached the plexiglass booth that housed Eddie, I assume, with trepidation. Eddie was a middle-aged man, his thinning hair pulled back into a ponytail as his Pantera t-shirt struggled to contain him. Even through the glass, I thought he looked distinctly greasy, and he looked up from whatever he was watching on his laptop with some misgivings. "I ain't got any spare change, pal, and I don't let people just crash in my lobby." I rolled my eyes, this sermon being pretty common amongst people who've never lived rough. Actually, I was wondering if I could rent a room for the night. Eddie looked me over and his glower softened. "It's 30 a night. Checkouts at 10 a.m. Cash up front. No refunds for stains or bugs." He tapped the slot at the bottom of the plexiglass, indicating that I could drop my cash in there. I bent down and fished 220s out of my sock. They were wet with sweat, but money was money in this economy. 30 was a lot to pay for a few hours of respite from the heat, but the thought of sweating out in the woods for the night had changed my mind. Eddie grimaced at the wet bills, but he slid them under the counter and flopped a 10 and a room key back at me. "Take room 5. Don't forget, checkouts at 10 a.m. And don't steal my towels." Then he turned back to his laptop and forgot I existed. The room was somewhere between swanky and skanky. There was a bed with a sagging mattress and some sheets that were only slightly stained. A bathroom with a shower and a sad stained toilet, and a TV that looked like it had seen most of the Reagan administration. All in all, it was a shithole, but it was better than sleeping in the woods. The only thing I cared about was sitting under the big window, and when it started pumping out cold air at subarctic temperatures, I was glad that I had shelled out for the room. The shower was amazing, but it was also the first indication I got that something was off. I left my clothes on the floor and climbed into the hot deluge. My skin felt like I'd stepped into a heat bank for a few seconds, but it passed as the hot lava coursed down my scalp. How long had it been? How long had it been since I'd had a real shower? How long had it been since I'd stood in a real shower, slept in a real bed, watched TV, had it all to myself? My eyes snapped open, though, when I heard the click of nails on the linoleum. The rings of the Dollar General curtain almost screamed as I yanked it hard to the side. My first thought had been rats. This place was slummy enough to have them, but I didn't see anything. The floor was stained, but my clothes were the only thing on it. I looked at the door, but it was closed. No rat could have squeezed under that thing. I pulled the curtain back, and it just started washing the day's sweat off of me when I heard it again. It was subtle, like claws on the lino, but when I looked at the curtain, I slammed hard against the cold plastic wall. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing and coming up short. It couldn't be what I was looking at, but I couldn't find any other way to explain it. The curtain was crawling with something big, something that looked like beetles. They were scuttling over the curtain, 4, 5, 7, 8, and as I slid into the ringed basin of the tub, I started hyperventilating a little. They were scuttling, their feet making the same clicking as they had on the bathroom floor. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them. They glared at me through the curtain as the steam clouded around them. As the water fell on my head, I gasped in pain as the shampoo I'd been working into my scalp ran into my eyes. I wiped at it, not wanting to lose track of the bugs, but as my vision cleared, I was looking at empty space and the gauzy film of the shower curtain. The bugs were gone, out of sight, but not out of mind. I searched the room, probably looking ridiculous in my old underoos, but I never found anything. Well, except for the stains on the mattress. They were a little hard to miss. I had gripped the mattress when I saw the old red stains on the side. If you've never seen old blood, then you may not realize what it looks like, but I'd seen my fair share on the farm. This was old blood, probably years old, and I made a mental note to sleep on top of the comforter that night. There were sheets on the bed, but you can only expect so much from fabric. I put my clothes back on and tried to make myself comfortable. It was hard. Those big bugs were still fresh in my mind, and as I lay on top of the sheet, I couldn't help but wonder where they had gotten off to. Were they waiting for me to turn off the light? Were they just sitting in the drain in the sink? As some movie played in the background, I found my eyes staring into the corners of the dingy room. The corners were dark, despite the lights being on, and I felt something lurking there. I fidgeted restlessly on the bed as something scrabbled over my leg. I couldn't find anything when I lifted it up, though. I was being paranoid. What did I care if the room had roaches or beetles or whatever? Hell, I often slept next to dumpsters or out in the woods. Just because these bugs had startled me didn't mean that they meant me harm, right? Despite my better judgment, I got under the covers and tried to get comfortable. The mattress was lumpy, but not too bad. There was a definite divot in the middle, though, a person-shaped indent worn from multiple bodies over multiple years. It seemed to be my only choice for sleeping locations. It wasn't a chasm or anything, but it had an uncomfortable dip on either side. I finally found myself giving up and lying in it, and as my eyes started to slip shut, I felt the bite. It wasn't hard, a little less than an ant bite, but it snapped me out of my semi-sleep and made me throw the covers back to look. I checked the bed, the sheets giving away nothing, and I couldn't find any ants or spiders or anything. I thought about bedbugs then, and I pulled my jeans back to look at my leg. It was nothing, a little red spot, but as I tried to settle in again, I felt another bite. It was followed by a third, a fourth, a fifth in seconds. I could feel something on my skin, little feet running up my legs, and the bites were painful. I rolled up my jeans and swatted at my legs, but there was nothing there. It was as though whatever had bitten me had just taken a chomp and left just as quick. I was back on the comforter in a flash, but the divot felt tainted. I sat to the left of it, shoulder against the wall as I put my back to the headboard, wishing I had just put up with the heat. I could just leave, I thought. This was America after all, and if I wanted to waste my money, then that was my business. The thought of going back out and sleeping in the woods, the heat falling over me like a blanket, was not at all appealing, though. I didn't like the thought of bugs crawling on me either, especially not bed bugs. Growing up, my parents had been fond of keeping dogs in the house, and I could remember spending nights with fleas crawling all over me as I sweated beneath my sheets. We had bed bugs a few times as well, and I remember the sleepless nights spent as they crawled and bit at me. It had led me to be very neat, something that persisted even into my homelessness, and it was almost funny that I hadn't felt truly dirty until coming inside somewhere for the night. It wasn't a big problem, though. Bugs didn't like cold, and I had the AC set on about 65. I could sleep on the comforter, avoid the worst of the bites, and still enjoy a nice cool evening indoors before returning to the heat tomorrow. When the power suddenly went out in my room, plunging me into darkness, I felt a small moan rise in my throat of its own will. I was left with nothing but my own breathing as I sat there on the saggy bed. The curtain window provided nothing but a ghostly inkling of a shadow light from the parking lot beyond. I crossed my arms around my chest as I began to shudder. The cold air hung around me like a cloud, but it would dissipate before long. Then, well, I might as well have just slept outside. The heat was oppressive, but at least the bugs were a little less forward. As I sat in the dark, I felt like I could hear the scuttling again. It was clicking, the noises scuttling across my brain. I looked around fretfully, trying to see where they were coming from. I wanted to run. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I just couldn't make my legs move. My eyes were roving in a panic when I saw the comforter begin to flutter. The divot made a little canyon in the bedclothes, and I could see something squirming up from that hole. They were big, looking like beetles from a kid's cartoon, and they came staggering up from the crater as they ruffled the comforter. They spread out as they searched for me, and I felt my horror growing as the waves began to flow my way. They were like a squad of army ants, making their uniform patrol as they looked for prey, and they were coming towards me. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got up and made a run for the door. I made a grab for my pack, but my fingers slipped off the rawhide loop at the top. I paused in the doorway, turning back to grab it, and that's when I saw them. The bugs on the shower curtain had been babies compared to these bloodsuckers. They were as large as dogs, their amber bodies clicking as they moved, and their piss-yellow eyes full of hate. They came lumbering after me, their proboscises quivering with anticipation. I slammed the door as I left the bag to them. I had a fleeting thought that I had left the room key on the nightstand, but that hardly mattered. I wouldn't have gone in there for $200,000, much less the $200 in change that was left in my travel sack. That's how I ended up running up the interstate towards Dothan with nothing but the clothes on my back and $10 on my sock. I must have looked pretty silly, but I didn't care. I was glad to be out of there, glad to be in the muggy air again, happy to have escaped with my life. And when the man in the Farmall truck came and picked me up a half an hour later, driving me the rest of the way to Dothan, I was glad to be able to feel the breeze that ruffled my hair. It felt better than Eddie's air conditioning ever could. Whenever I get the wanderlust again, I just think back to that night 3 years ago, and I count myself lucky to have gotten out with my life. It turned out that Dothan was some of the things I had been looking for, and others I hadn't even thought about. I found work. I found a place to stay that wasn't a park bench. And when the farm I got hired to pick pecans at was out of pecans for the season, the farmer was already having me work on his books to get him and his finances back in order. I moved into a little rental on the land, and I'm glad to say that my wandering days are over for now. I put this story here as a warning to those who still wonder, though. Eddie's prices may seem like a good deal, but watch out for the things you get on top of the bed and the TV. Those bed bugs have teeth, and you may end up as just another stain on the mattress if you aren't careful.
Whew. Day's getting on a bit, but time spent on the lake is never time wasted, even when you're having crappy luck with the fish like I am. We've all heard the phrase, everything must go, but are we really prepared for the consequences when everything has gone? Well, that's something we may speculate on today with this story, a story about how everything must indeed go.
My boss was smiling as he tossed the flyer on my desk. I could see Jasper and Marcus turning to smile at me as well as I picked up the notice and scowled at it. I've been at Farseer News for about 6 months now, but it's far from my first brush with journalism. I used to write for a news source in Washington. I won't name them. They probably don't want to be brought into all of this. And before that, I wrote for my college newspaper. That's where I received my degree in English and journalism. And that was back when my future seemed bright. I worked as a journalist for 6 years, but that was before everything went to hell. I won't go into details, but it was a story that everyone said I should have left alone. I wouldn't, though. I was young and still looking for my big break, and the story seemed perfect. It was, I guess, perfectly capable of ripping my career to shreds, that is. When it was all said and done, no one would touch me. Couldn't even get a job cleaning toilets in a building with news ties, and I'd thought it was over. Until the call came from Farseer. It's a paper in Gavin, one of the largest cities in the tri-state area, but it's as far from D.C. as it gets in terms of journalism. Out here I'd be covering cattle auctions and ladies' auxiliary bake sales and state fairs. I started to turn them down, but after some rumination and a lot of alcohol, I decided that it might be just the thing to fix my credibility. Maybe after a few years of writing about less sensational stories, I could go back to writing about, serious topics again. I could fix my image, maybe find a little public corruption to open the shades on, and get on with something more grand. I could work my way back into the industry and get my name back. Then I'd find somewhere away from politics and get back on my feet. I couldn't have known, however, that the head of my department was someone who liked to screw with people. My boss, Andrew, and his buddies, Jasper and Marcus, are as far from journalists as you can get. They all have degrees from the local community college in English or journalism, but the dynamic around the bullpen is more like the one you'd find in the office. Andrew is the Michael Scott of our department, handing down judgments and comedy in equal parts. Marcus is like a less likable Jim, and Jasper is the Stanley, older and constantly sleeping through his deadlines. I guess that makes me the Dwight, and they don't mind using me for the butt of their jokes. You should have seen Andrew during my interview as he realized my credentials. He looked almost gleeful at the prospect of having a real journalist on his team that he could mess with. Case in point, the flyer he had just tossed down was for the closing of a local institution in the neighboring town of Foreman. The closing of a discount warehouse store that had existed on the corner of Beck and Mills since the Depression. "What's this?" I said, looking up from a story that I'd been writing about last week's big event. "That is your assignment for today, old junior field journalist." Junior field journalist was another thing that Andrew had made up to demean me. He knew I'd been a hotshot columnist in the big city and decided to take me down a peg with the big stories he handed down. The stories were everything from dog fashion shows to pumpkins that looked a little like Elvis. He found the obscure stories seemingly from nowhere, and he handed them to me with the air of someone bestowing great honor on a lesser. He mostly did it so he and the other community college journalists could laugh at me as I went off to chase the story. "Can't anyone else do this? I'm working on the governor's Clean Air Initiative piece." "Actually, I sent your notes over to Jasper, so you'd have a free afternoon to give this story your full attention." I ground my teeth and listened to my molars groan like sails in a high breeze. "You did what?" "No need to thank me. I mean, it's not every day that a historic institution like the Discount Warehouse goes out of business. We want your full attention on this story so you can tell us all about the last great sale on this time capsule of Americana. Feel free to use that line if you like," he said, walking off as Marcus and Jasper snickered at me. The whole thing just felt way too much like the actions of a cartoon villain. With little choice left, I packed up my things and went off to chase the story. I was fuming as I drove the 30-odd miles to Foreman. I was tired of being treated this way by people who had learned everything about news reporting from their high school AV club. The stories that the farseer took on were often fluff pieces, and sometimes even borderline tabloid news. For every serious story we took on, there were a dozen others about beauty pageant winners and food-eating contests and pieces just labeled local color. I was sick of being stuck with these nothing filler bits. What's worse is that they weren't even anything you could hang a new career on. No respectable paper would want to see your name attached to a drunken fiddle contest, and no one would be impressed by my dissertation on the Little Miss Southwest regional pageant. I'd been hoping to craft this into a new start, but it looked like I'd be stuck at the farseer for the foreseeable future. The money was nice, though, so I guess that was a plus. The interstate was fairly uneventful, and I arrived in Foreman without too much fanfare. When they tell you that Gavin is the largest city in the tri-state area, they mean it. Gavin, as it happens, has a population of about 25,000 on a good census year. The whole area is very rural, which means there's a lot of very nice cow fields and pigs to look at as you drive. Gavin has 5 restaurants, a city hall, a public pool, a drive-in, several strip malls that are slowly expiring, and a Walmart that's usually being sold by one of the $5 generals in the area. There's 20 traffic lights in the whole town, and the rest of the roads are watched over by stop signs and good manners. If Gavin is a big town, then Foreman is a pothole. You can tell when you're pulling into Foreman because of the seemingly endless array of trailer parks on the outskirts. They have cute little names like Shady Pines and Whispering Oaks or Sunnydale, but what they amount to is a sea of plastic and chrome that stretches for well over 10 miles. I'm pretty certain that the trailer parks are bigger than the whole town, but that's just a guess. As sad as all that humanity on display is, the town is downright tragic. There was once a thriving burg here, I've been told, but it relied mostly on the pulpwood industry and the small coal mining operation that took place in the area. Now the coal's played out, the pulpwood's going out, and Foreman is a town that seems unaware that it's dying. If you drive up the main street, you can see more buildings for rent than that are open. It has a city municipal building that doubles as a city hall, a working railroad that will likely outlive the town, and several strip malls with the usual collection of pizza joints and cell phone stores. A few pawn shops and hardware stores seem to be struggling along, but the only thing in Foreman doing any business is the Moosehead pub and the small local police force waiting for drunks outside said pub. I suppose the lack of business was why I was here, though. I kept expecting to see a Walmart or at least a Dollar General or a Family Dollar, but the longer I drove without seeing one, the odder it felt. Had Discount Warehouse been that big of an institution? I suppose the little discount chains would pop up like mushrooms, now that Thriftmeyer was forced to loosen his grip on the region. Discount Warehouse sat in a historical building that had once been a Thriftmeyer all-goods store. Mr. Thriftmeyer, who I assume had changed his name for marketing reasons, had owned a chain of Thriftmeyer all-goods stores across the Tri-County area. They rebranded as Discount Warehouse in the late 70s and incorporated furniture and housewares into the business model. Discount Warehouse was more like a small Walmart or a large Dollar General, and the economy had started weeding them out in the late 2000s. This was the last of the Thriftmeyer line, and today would end his legacy as a houseware and small appliance juggernaut. You like that? It's the opening of my article, and all with nothing more than 30 minutes in the car and a Google search. I did a little more looking and discovered that the Thriftmeyers still own the chain. Thriftmeyer Sr. had died around the time of the rebranding, 1978 it said, but his son was just as business savvy as his old man, it appeared. Jacob Thriftmeyer Jr. had been running his father's store since the mid-20s, and he was still managing the store well into his 80s. The article said that he had hoped to rebrand again and keep the business open, but the bank had other ideas and would no longer extend their loan. The store had been operating in the red for years, and the tab had finally come due. Jacob Thriftmeyer had begrudgingly signed over his business to the bank and was getting ready to enter retirement. I felt for the old guy, but I suppose all good things had to come to an end. I wasn't exactly sure I would call the parking lot I was currently in a good thing, however. The building was a large brick box with a black awning that appeared to have been added after the fact. The doors were not the fancy sliding ones that most stores had, but large glassed ones with handles that jutted out from the front. The concrete parking lot was old and rutted, the pavement in sad need of leveling and replaning. The people who had gathered here looked like cattle at an auction, and they all just sort of milled about aimlessly. There were some kids among them, pale youths holding their parents' hands, and it was here that I saw some emotion. Most of them were jittering around like kids will do, and all of them seemed to possess a certain air of excitement. As I got out of the car, notebook in hand, I went to join the collected humanity. I heard the snap of an elastic from overhead and looked up to see small flags that had been hung on a rope running from the awning to the light poles that dotted the parking lot. They were black and white, the wind pushing them aimlessly, and it made me think of a funeral. This whole event was a funeral, I supposed, and as I got close, a banner fell to block the awning, and the illusion was complete. It was black with white letters, and the sentiment seemed very fitting later on. "Everything must go," it proclaimed, and the sight of it gave me the willies. A small stage had been erected, and there was a cheery man in a cheap suit standing beside an old, stooped man in a much nicer suit. He had to be Jacob Thriftmeyer Jr., but the younger man was unknown to me. He was beaming out at the crowd, looking happy to be there, or anywhere on such a day as this. He glanced towards the sky as the wind snapped at the flags, and his smile seemed to wither a little. The clouds were becoming dark, and it looked like the weather might wash out the last great deal of the discount warehouse. Would everything still go in the rain? I supposed it would, and I was right. I wish I hadn't been. I'm proud to see so many of Foreman's finest out to say goodbye to the city's institution that's been here since the town was little more than a logging hub. Logging hub might have been a stretch, but I supposed this was the mayor of Foreman. I've shopped here with my family for as long as I can remember, and the deals we've all found at the discount warehouse were like nothing seen anywhere else. Jacob Thriftmeyer has helped keep the specter of corporate greed from overtaking our town, and we will be sorry to see him go. Mr. Thriftmeyer himself would like to say a few words, and I think we owe him that much. The applause were scattered and half-hearted, and the old man approached the mic slowly before trying to lower it to his level. The banner kept catching my attention, and it just seemed off somehow. Everything must go. I'd never thought about that statement before, but it was a little foreboding if you looked at it in a certain light. The kind of light that hovered around here, for example. Everything must go. If everything went, then what would be left? Would Foreman remain? Would Gavin be safe? How much would be left behind once everything had gone? The reedy voice of Jacob Thriftmeyer Jr. brought me back to the stage. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My father opened up Thriftmore All Goods a year before the Great Depression sunk its claws into this country. I have strived to keep his legacy afloat, but it seems I have failed. I have failed this town. I failed all of you. And now we must pay the price. I furrowed my brow as I took a shorthand missive of the speech. This was a weird one, even for the ramblings of a geriatric store owner. The people seemed as confused as he was, but the children seemed to know already. While the parents stood in polite boredom, the children were looking around with what I thought was excitement, but I quickly realized was fear. Their neck hair was up for some reason, and they all seemed on the edge of fleeing. It was like house pets just before a tornado hits. They sense the change in pressure, the change in the air, but they can do nothing but wait for it to hit and hope it doesn't simply squash them flat. That should have been a warning, but I ignored it yet again. I was here to get a story, and I meant to be done with it before the whole day was wasted. This store held the town together, in hard times and good times. Many of you have bought your furniture here for your first place, the crib for your first baby, the groceries for your last meal. But today, it all comes to an end. Today is the final moments of Foreman. So, drink them in while you can. The mayor was looking at him oddly, some of those who had come to watch looking as if his words had broken through their daze. The children, however, stood straight as fence posts, just waiting for whatever was to come. They seemed to sense the portents, and I remember thinking that some of them might make it out, though I didn't know why the thought had occurred. Make it out of what? What would they need to escape? I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but this store has not existed on its own for all these years. When my father opened his doors in 1932, he was full of hope for the future. He just knew that this would bring his family stability, bring them wealth, and so it did. Even through the Great Depression, Dad made money hand over fist, and he was very generous with the community. Foreman thrived because of my father's money. But somewhere along the way, you all forgot that." The mayor's pasted-on smile was beginning to slip, but when he reached for the mic, Jacob Thriftmeyer gave him a stony look, and he backed away. Thriftmeyer was going to say his piece, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. "It's true, and you all know it's true. I kept the riffraff out. I kept the Dollar Generals and the Family Dollars and even the likes of Sam Walton's monstrosity out of this town. And how did you all repay me? You turned your noses up at the local businesses, at the businesses that had made this town great, and you drove to Gavin or Bryson or he spat onto the hot top, McAllister, to shop at Walmart and Target and Costco as the town died around you. You put pennies over people, and now you reap what you have sown." He looked out across the crowd, looking furious with them as they looked down sheepishly. I was astonished. Did he blame them for the fall of his empire? "Don't bother looking contrite. I know what all of you think. I know you think that those vultures will be here to nibble my corpse once my store is closed. But you are wrong. You don't live as long as I have without picking up some tricks. And today, I give you all my last deal." He wetted his lips, preparing to speak the words that must be spoken. He turned to the doors, and when he thrust his hands toward them, they opened to reveal the horror they had been holding at bay. "Everything must go!" As he said it, the doors came open and a thick black smoke came pouring out. It was almost like floating tar, the cloud impenetrable as it hovered out. The effect was galvanizing. The sleepy crowd began to murmur and then to back away. They were unsure what to make of this, but as they got closer, they began to scream and run from the encroaching smoke bank. Some of them, however, stood mesmerized by it. Some walked towards it, and those who disappeared into it were lost within that smoke. I saw most of this, however, from the inside of my car. The final declaration, the negation of the town itself, had moved me as it had moved the doors, and I was bringing my car to life before I realized I had moved at all. The car seemed sluggish to start, the engine making a sleepy grinding noise as it came to life, and before pulling away from the store, I looked back at the old man as he stood atop the podium. His hands were raised in exaltation, his eyes cast skyward, and as the cloud pressed against his back, I thought it might reject him for the briefest of moments. Then it gobbled him up, along with the stunned mayor, and I was leaving the lot on squealing tires. As I drove out of town, I saw the smoke rising behind me. It swallowed the town in a plume of thick gray death, but it seemed I was the only vehicle leaving town. The people I passed on the sidewalk, the ones coming out to look at the cloud, seemed to be mesmerized by all that smoke. They didn't run like the others had, the ones out in front of the store, and I was tempted to stop and shout at them. I wanted them to run, to escape the smoke, but most of them seemed to have accepted their fate. The farther I drove, the more I feared that the smoke would never stop and would simply engulf everything. Every mile I drove, the less I believed I would make it home. When I made it to my apartment, it hardly filled me with a sense of serenity. I'm on the couch now, my phone ringing off the hook as the office tries to get a hold of me. They want to know the same thing the news anchors want to know. What happened to Foreman? They say the town is simply missing. the smoke cloud having cleared to reveal raw earth and nothing else. The streets, the buildings, the trailer parks, the main street, everything was gone. It had been removed down to the dirt, and no one seemed to have escaped whatever it was that had happened. They were looking for witnesses, for anyone with information, and my boss and his friends seemed to be doing the same. I guess I was the only one who'd seen what happened, and it was something that would stick with me for a long time. I don't know what to do now, but I know one thing for sure. The sign didn't lie. Everything had to go, so everything went.
Sun's dipping low now. Might be time to point my oars for home, but I think we've got time for one more story while we row this boat ashore. We've all been to some strange locales, I'm sure. I'm no different in that respect. My mother was a big one for ghost tours and haunted places, so I followed her into a lot of houses that I suspected the scariest thing in there was the black mold. But maybe, just maybe, if you're planning on trekking to haunted places, beware the Toymakers woods.
Some of you might remember me. I'm the traveling photographer who chases photos in strange locales. My story about the ghost grass hermit got the attention of a magazine that was interested in strange locales. It's not as much traveling as I'm used to, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't nice to sleep in a bed more than on the ground. I've spent the night in haunted hotels in Louisiana, shrieking forests in the Midwest, and looking for strange creatures in the various backwoods of the American South. So when I got the message about checking out a forest in Maine, I was a little hesitant. This time of year, the weather is likely to be frigid, and blundering into haunted woods in the middle of winter is no one's idea of a good time. The check the magazine was talking about writing me, however, was definitely a game changer. So I packed my stuff and headed out. I had time to read up on it while I flew from Tampa, skunk ape sighting had turned out to be a homeless guy, to Maine, the home of the king of horror, and some pretty picturesque scenery. The locals claim that the woods were home to some malevolent spirit, it seemed. A spirit who made toys. Local legend said that the people have been finding wooden toys in the woods for years, the first being reported in 1860. After 1850 or so, there was supposed to be an old man who lived in the woods out there. An old man who sometimes came into town to sell homemade goods. He had the usual fare, bowls and animals and things, but his puppets were supposed to draw buyers from far and wide. He made enough from his hand-carved goods to live comfortably away from society, and most people just believed he was a harmless old man. One winter, however, a group of kids went missing. The town turned out to try to find them, but as the snow came down and the hour grew late, hope seemed to dwindle that they'd ever be found. They asked the old man if he'd seen the missing kids, and he shook his head and told them he would keep an eye out for them. As the snow piled up and the winter wind whipped, the people in town began to wonder if he had maybe seen the kids and just wasn't saying. Someone said a few of the boys had been seen talking to him not long ago, admiring his puppets and hanging around his stand. They began to get a little stir-crazy, thinking about the boys and picturing all kinds of unnatural things he could be doing out there. So in the dead of winter, they had gone out and broken down the old man's door, handing out a savage beating and searching every nook and cranny for the missing kids. Except they never found any kids, and the beating they handed down had been a little too zealous. The old man was dead, and when the snows melted, the town found the kids in a snowdrift under a makeshift lean-to that they had used to get out of the snow. The townspeople sure were sorry about what they had done, but when they went to dig the old man up so they could bury him in the churchyard, his body was gone. They said they had glimpsed smoke coming up the chimney as well when they approached, and candles that suddenly went out when they knocked on the door. After that, the puppets had started appearing in the woods. Some people admitted to having hung them in memory of the old man and the terrible thing they had done to him, but some of them couldn't be accounted for by the mourners. People went missing every now and again too, and some of the puppets began to look like the missing people. The forest had since been integrated into the state park, and the Toymaker's cabin was one of the park's landmarks. It had been well maintained, as had the surrounding woods, and lots of people came to see the Toymaker's woods. When my plane landed in Portland around 3.5 hours later, I was raring to have a look at the place. It was another 3 hours in a rental car from there, heading up into the heart of Maine as I followed the signs to a little town on the edge of the Maslow State Park called Bucklowder. They were pegged as one of those rustic tourist towns, kind of like Williamsburg, but with less PR. They had done okay, I suppose, and it was likely thanks in part to the people who came to write stories about them. I rolled in right around nightfall and found people in long skirts and buckle hats closing up shop for the night. The tourists had either gone somewhere else or had turned in for the night, and now the blacksmiths and the hunters and tanners could go home and watch TV and eat dinner and get some sleep so they could do it again tomorrow. The Hog's Mouth Inn was my destination, and I was glad to see it as I drove into the parking lot behind the building. The snow flurries had been coming down for the last 2 hours, and I was very glad I had thought to pack winter clothes when I left Florida, which had been a balmy 72 degrees when I got on the plane. The temperature gauge on my car said it was about 32 now, and the tourists were going to be in for a real winter scene tomorrow, I had no doubt. After checking in, I decided to come downstairs and have a look at their after-hours show. The bar area was a series of long tables where guests and actors ate by candlelight and paid a pretty penny for the ambience. The place had a pretty steep price tag for somewhere I was expected to sleep on a mattress I'd expect to see at a Howard Johnson and eat vegetable stew with a bunch of guys in rough-spun clothes. But the magazine was footing the bill for expenses, and I decided there would likely be no better place for getting local legends than right here in town. So I sat at the bar, ate some lukewarm stew, drank a watered-down beer, and asked the woman in the apron if she knew anything about the legend of the Toymaker's woods. Her eyes went wide, but it was clearly not the first time that she had been asked. "I wouldn't go out there if I was you. It's a haunted place, and it has a dark aura about it." "So I've heard," I said, setting down the glass and asking for another. "So does the old Toymaker still leave the puppets in the trees?" She didn't seem to like the question, but it was probably the accompanying smirk that set her off. That smirk tried to tell her that we both knew better. I was still pretty sure this was something the locals were doing to promote tourism at this point. An idea I wouldn't be divested of for a while yet. "He does, as I think you know. You think yourself witty by making fun of our local legends, but there are still some things in this world that can't be explained away so easily. You'd think that someone like yourself, someone who'd seen the unexplainable and lived to tell, would be a little more open-minded." I was speechless. Had she read my article? "How do you know It's plain to those who've lived in the shadow of strange and terrible things all their lives. Let's hope you'll come out of the woods as easily as you came out of whatever it was you ran afoul of before." I finished my second drink in silence, the barmaid moving to the other end of the polished wooden edifice and shooting dark looks at me until I left my money and took my leave. I woke up the next morning to find a winter wonderland outside and had to make a trip to the local outfitters before setting out. One pair of hiking boots, some snow pants, and several other warm bits of cover later, and I was off. The outfitter had also sold me a map of the area, which showed the start of the trailhead not too far from the edge of town. It took a little longer than I would have liked to find it in the snow, but I eventually oriented myself and found the Toymakers trailhead. The snow had turned the woods into a German fairy tale, and as I made my way down the snowy path, I couldn't help but feel a little like some peasant kid trying to find his way home. With all that colorless terrain surrounding me, it almost felt like I was back in the ghost grass again. The sign at the start of the path told me that it was about 3 miles to the Toymaker's cabin. Not a very strenuous walk in the summer or the spring, but in the snow, it would feel more like 5 or 6. The powder wasn't waist deep, of course, but I was keenly aware of the crunch, crunch, crunch of my new snow boots as I made my way towards the cabin. I had my camera out and decided to take a few pictures of the expansive winter landscape as I went. I saw signs of deer in the snow, some frozen pellets, probably left by a rabbit, and when I went to take a picture of some long plants jutting from a frozen icy pond, I saw the first of the puppets. I've been saying puppets, but I suppose what they were was marionettes. I inspected a few of them and found nowhere to put a hand to make the mouth move. They were sitting in trees, hanging from branches by their strings, some of them lying on the ground in a heap, but all of them looked meticulously crafted and expertly carved. They were dressed in all manner of outfits, but a lot of them looked like they might be wearing jogging pants or hiking clothes. Some of them were definitely children, and seeing them hanging merrily from the trees made me remember the story that I had read about this place. Walking through all this snow made me wonder if this was what the kids had experienced as they trudged through that same snow, cold and hungry, just trying to get home again. The farther I went, the more it seemed like I too could easily get lost out here. I was a tourist, but I could imagine that even the locals would be hard-pressed to find their way out of here. All this white, all this ice would cover up landmarks and make it that much easier to get turned around. You could blunder around out here for hours just trying to find the right trail, only to realize that you'd gone deeper into the woods instead of closer to town. The woods were made up of birches and spruces, hardy old pines, and the snow bothered them not at all. They hung close together, bearing the weight of all that powder stoically, and amongst the limbs were the puppets that I had come to see. Always those infernal puppets. When it began to get dark, I realized that I'd been wandering this trail for hours. It had been early morning when I left, 8 or 9 at the latest, and as I watched the sun begin to dip a little, I started getting worried that I was lost. The map I had did very little to help. The area was unknown to me, and the landmarks that would have meant something to the locals were just so much snow-covered nothing. I still hadn't come to the Toymaker's cabin, and with every step I was less sure that I would ever find it. It was 3:30 by my watch when I noticed the smoke curling up on the horizon, and I headed towards it like a dying man towards rescue. I had hoped it was someone's chimney in town, but the closeness of the trees made me think it might be the cabin that I'd been looking for. The thought that somebody had hiked out here at first light to pretend to be some creepy toy maker made me want to applaud his resilience, but I was hoping that he had a snowmobile or something to get back to town. Hell, I would settle for a guide to find my way back to the trailhead at this point. Whoever was up here likely knew the way out at any rate, and I was cold and soaked enough to want to get back somewhere warm. My hands shook a little as I came up to the cabin, my camera coming up as I clicked a few pictures of the dark wood dwelling. It was a single-room cabin, nothing fancy by today's standards, but it was long and likely contained a loft above the floor. I could just imagine the workshop that must exist inside there, the tables and benches that held the creations, the wonders that he would create there, and suddenly I wanted to see it. I went right on wanting a peek until my knock was answered by something from a nightmare. The door opened with a long and ominous creak, and inside was less than inviting. The shadows weren't particularly long outside, but the inside of the workshop was pitch black. The face that leered out had an unsettlingly toothy grin to go along with its coal red eyes. Its body was undeterminable, the dark hiding it like a cloak, but its face loomed down at me like a jack-o'-lantern from a high shelf. He grinned at me from a space near the top of the door, and I felt my lower lip tremble a little as his eyes fell on me. "Well, hello, traveler. You look cold. Would you like to come inside and sit by the fire?" Its voice sounded like an echo from the pits of hell, but that wasn't what had decided me on backing away from the invitation. When the door had opened, a smell like wet copper had nearly bowled me over. It was a smell like blood, and I knew that if I went into that house, I would never come out again. No, thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I was just wondering which way would get me back to town." "That way," it said, and I assumed it must have pointed. "I'd walk with you, but I can't abide the light. It hurts my eyes, you see. If you'd like to wait until the sun sets, however, I'd be happy to walk you back to town." I shook my head. "No, thank you. My friends are waiting for me, and I must be going." "Of course. Hurry along now." As it closed the door, the portal creaked on swollen hinges, but not loud enough for me to hear it whisper, "Wouldn't want you to be caught out after dark, now would we?" I ran as fast as I could, using the puppets as a guidepost. Suddenly their height in the tree made sense. This thing had been crouching to talk to me, and I bet its arms would have no trouble placing those puppets in the boughs of the nearby firs. They seemed to taunt me as I ran, enticing me to hurry. The sun might keep it inside for now, they seemed to say through their painted smiles, but what will happen when it goes down? I haven't been so afraid since I lay on the floor of the hermit shack, listening as I wondered if he would kill me. I ran as the sun set, and fate must have been with me that day. The journey that had taken me all day seemed to end in a few minutes, and I could soon see the town in profile as the sun set behind it. I raced the shadows into town, expecting to hear a howl or a scream as the darkness allowed him to leave his den, and as I closed the door of the inn behind me, I saw the patrons at the bar looking up questioningly. The barmaid, however, seemed to know exactly what had happened. As I came to rest at the bar, snow falling off my clothes, she set a mug of something hot down in front of me. Her look was knowing, like she had guessed what had happened, but it also looked sympathetic, like she understood what I had been through. It was pretty clear that she too had been to the cabin and possibly even seen something that haunted her to this day. "Don't worry, it doesn't come into town. Never has, not since our great-great-great-grandsires kicked in its door and murdered it for a crime it had no part of. It's called the Toymakers' Woods for a reason, and that's where it hunts its prey." I nodded, taking a sip of the mead she put down in front of me. It was warm and thick and good. "How many have gone missing in those woods?" I asked, not really sure I wanted the answer. "Not so many as you might think. Enough that the Forestry Service goes out with dogs a few times a month, but never after dark. It prefers to take locals if it can. It remembers that the townspeople are responsible for its suffering, and it means to exact revenge a drop at a time. To its credit, it probably kills as few tourists as it can. Tourists are usually noticed when they go missing. The locals know to stay out of the woods or to accept the dangers of going in." I stayed in Bucklowder for a few days, the snowdrifts making me afraid to take my rental car back on the road. By the time the snows began to recede some, I had a great article full of Bucklowder's history and lore. My editor loved it, my readers loved it, and it definitely made an impression on yours truly. I Had a little more respect for local color after that, though it certainly didn't stop my editor from sending me to strange and interesting places. I'm sure you'll hear from me again sometime, but until then, remember to trust that funny feeling you get sometimes when you're out on the trail or hiking in an unfamiliar area. It just might save you from becoming part of a local legend yourself.
Well, I guess the fish have gone to bed, so now it's time for me to as well. Don't bother with the boat. I'll get it in due time. But I'm glad you could come out with me today and hear some great stories and allow me the pleasure of enjoying some great company. Till next time, Dr. Plague signing off. Have a wonderful day and a spooky evening.